Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Bill Miller, who's going to discuss his latest book, The Mystery of Courage. Well, welcome to Rip Rap, Bill. It's a double pleasure to have you on the program, especially since we discussed your previous book, The Anatomy of Disgust, during the first interview for Rip Rap. I must say that, like your book on disgust, your exploration of the conceptualization of courage is a complex and intriguing scholarly work. But what led you to take a look at courage and to do so in so many contexts? You've got ancient Greece, medieval Europe, the American Civil War, World War I, and even the Vietnam War.
Actually, I intended this book initially to be a book on cowardice and to be part of a trilogy with a book I wrote on humiliation, then disgust, and then cowardice, kind of the downside of life, or anxiety-ridden experience. And what happened is because if you're going to write about cowardice, you of course have to look at the corresponding virtue. It's the one example in all the virtues and vices where the virtue is consistently more interesting than the vice. So if you're writing a book on temperance, you're going to end up wanting to write more about lust and imbibement. But if you write a book on cowardice, you start out with cowardice, you quickly realize, no, the virtue is more interesting. And so, and it's just self-evident that that's the case, because in fact, the stories we most like to tell, the stories that comprise most of our literature up at least until 200 years ago when the novel kind of changed it a little bit, is about courage. They're stories about courage. And I mean, cowardice is necessarily part of them, but courage is, the virtue is front and center, not the vice. And the virtue generates better stories than cowardice does. So I switched. And with it came a shift in tone. The book is very respectful in tone. There's not a lot of wryness about it. And it ended up taking me, of course, to the philosophers, but then to the soldiers and soldier memoirs. And that was one of the real benefits of researching this book, was to read deeply in that literature.
Well, I noticed several different parts during the book. You talk about the origin, the etymology of the words, courage, virtue, and I thought that was interesting because you also talk about how it was a manly, it's courage and men and chastity and women.
Yeah, well, it's one of the, I suppose I could use the word, it's a gendered virtue, at least traditionally. So that courage is the virtue of men. It's the rite of passage for little boys to have to test it. And in every language except, most languages except for English, the word for courage is also the word for man. And vir in Latin gives virtue, which earlier had the meaning of courage. And in English, and still in English, we say manliness, frankness, the kind of male, the male virtue is intimately tied with the conception of courage. At the same time, and we still to this day call people who are not courageous words for female sexual organs. We call them women, sissies, sister. And so the language of courage and cowardice has been, from the earliest writings onward, cross-culturally, been gendered. Now, of course, it's all being highly contested because of the women's movement, but it's been contested earlier on. Christianity contested that arrangement of things, actually, much earlier than that.
And the other point that you were making in the book, there doesn't seem to be one single theory. And I think that was that can adequately encompass all these, what I call clusters or strands of thinking.
Well, right at the core, if you, courage starts on pretty much on the battlefield, and that's where its initial conceptualization takes place, is about martial virtue, or protecting your loved ones and what you care about from real manifest external danger. But right from the start, you have two theories of courage: as the person who charges, the aggressor, who races ahead and to attack, more courageous than the person who stands there and doesn't give way when he is attacked. So you have the courage of offense and the courage of defense. And right at the start, there's like contesting about who's the toughest one. And you see that there's philosophical discussions about it, and there's soldier discussions about it. And when you get on the courage of defense side, what happens is that expands and gets you off the battlefield, because what the courage of defense ends up being about is about taking crap endlessly. The misery of just patience, endurance, and sufferance and suffering. And so the courage of defense starts to expand into just the domain of just plain dealing with misery itself and not complaining or just accepting and stuff like that. So right from the start, you get this kind of contention about which is the perfect manifestation of courage, that manly quick spurt, or the more generally applicable long-term endurance, which is equally available to men and probably even actually more so to women.
What I thought was fascinating, this is sort of a side note, but not entirely, is when I was looking for the book, it was in the psychology section in one bookstore and military history in another.
Yeah, it's I've seen it in literature, in psychology, in military history, and in philosophy.
Even though you pretty clearly say it's not military history.
It's not military history, although it focuses, a lot of its focus is on these soldier memoirs. They provide me, they are the authority, basically, the real authority for so many of the statements I generate and ideas I try and deal with are best dealt with by people who are under fire.
One of the things I've noticed that you tend to do, and you did that with anatomy, is you get a text. Like with Anatomy of Disgust, it was John Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, and then it seems to be less like the organizing principle or something, not entirely the whole research for it, but in this instance, it was a Civil War soldier.
Actually, the title is a slight change in wording of a phrase that a Civil War soldier, a Union officer from Maine, who I think achieved the rank finally of major, named Abner Small, and he wrote a memoir about 20, 30 years after the war in which he talked about the mystery of bravery. And for him it meant that you could never predict which of those guys was going to be the one to turn tail and which was going to be the one to really just fight like Achilles. And it could be the funny little accountant or storekeeper one day, and the big tough guy would turn and run, and he just said it's absolutely a mystery to him who was going to play what role. And you couldn't even predict on what day who would play what role by prior performance. And so he was mystified by that, the kind of varying, that you just, the people you think would be it weren't necessarily going to be it, and the people you thought were going to be it weren't necessarily going to be it. So.
And you talk, too, about body type as not necessarily being there's an expectation that if you're big, blonde, and brutal, with a lot of muscle, that would be, and that's not necessarily
Well, we want our virtues to look certain ways. And it's clear that if you look at, like, your average academic, or me, or something like that, say, low predictor for courage. You look at a longshoreman, and somebody built like that, and you say, at least toughness is going to be there. And with toughness, we like to think that maybe courage isn't far behind. But in fact, the soldiers consistently, what they love is they keep careful track of any time one of these big tough guys turns and runs. The average soldier just loves it when one of those guys cracks, because they feel a little inferior to those big tough guys, and then they like to see it. And another thing that comes out is that it used to be the view, Aristotle's view, and a view that was subscribed to widely, and still is subscribed to widely among people who think about virtue, is that once you are a virtuous person and have trained yourself up to be a virtuous person, you are going to be virtuous, in this case courageous, in all the instances that require courage. And in fact, that was so that if once you got that disposition for courage, you're going to be courageous. Well, starting in the latter couple of years of the Civil War, and then clearly in World War I, the amount of just unrelenting misery these guys had to face meant that nobody could be courageous for 2 years running. You just ran out of gas. And so an image starts to take over. Instead of courage being this thing that once you had for good, they start to substitute a metaphor of a bank account. And you only got so much courage, and it's just going to start being drawn. You draw your accounts down. You draw your accounts down, and eventually you're going to crack. And what happened is it seems like the Civil War, in the last couple of years of the Civil War, that started to be apparent. In World War I, it was just manifest. And the other thing that happened is that when you're a little old Greek warrior going out to battle, you line up in your phalanx, and you got your spear and you got your sword, and you're going to be hacked, pierced, maybe shot with an arrow, and stamped on. You got about 4 ways you're going to die. The Civil War, once the war gets mechanized, you got exploding shells, you got mortars, you got howitzers, you got cannons, you got rifle fire, you got, in World War I, gas, and you start to get, some people find that they can face bullets pretty well, rifle fire. The same people who can face bullets well aren't always the same people who can face artillery fire. So you get some people are courageous when it's one weapon being thrown at them, and another who are just collapse when it's the other weapon being thrown at them.
There they talked about the sound.
They can't. A lot of the things that you see is that the sound of exploding shells cracks a lot of people.
Because they could hear them coming in.
They hear them coming. They hear them coming in. Bullets, you only hear them going by. You only hear them once they're by you. Shells, you hear them coming. Artillery shells, you hear them coming. And this was just more than some people could bear. The other thing is just when they explode, they just percuss, and you can't think. I mean, your thoughts get blown out of your head. And so you get disoriented by them. But there's some people who clearly can handle shell fire, who can't handle somebody thinking that somebody's actually aiming a gun at them. A rifleman actually aiming a gun. Shells are just kind of being lobbed in a general direction. Whereas there's a lot of people who just can't bear shell fire and can actually take the risks with the bullets. One of the reasons is that if you get hit by a bullet, most people still look like a corpse, even though they can look at the corpses will look like a person. And you get hit by a shell, the person who was sitting there is just not there anymore. It's just a bunch of goo on you or something like that. And that was very disconcerting to people. And a lot of people just cracked in the face of that. Some people lost their religious faith. Those who believed whose faith would be very necessarily bound up with a belief in the resurrection of the body, shell fire, artillery fire, made a mess of that belief sometimes. There's no way that God could put the pieces back together again.
It just happened when I was reading your book. I was also reading All Quiet on the Western Front, and there's that. It was kind of an interesting juxtaposition at the time because they talk about shell fire was people being blown up into trees nude because the shell fire just, had that kind of devastation.
Or people just turning into shrapnel. So some person gets hit, and the person next to him dies because of that guy's bone in his heart or something. Grim stuff.
Yeah, some of the clusters you talk about the psychology of courage and the politics of courage and the theory of courage. But the psychology of courage, which I think we've been talking about, is very complex.
One of the things that got me going was just a kind of little self kind of analysis. I was thinking, there are thousands of times I can remember what it felt like to be a coward. Every day there's little things that where you're polite and swallow something that you really just, if the world were just, you would just even the score right then and there. And so you feel, you have these, you're aware of what the costs of cowardice are, the feelings of shame, the sinking feeling, the lying awake with fantasies of revenge. And I was trying to think, okay, that's the psychology of cowardice. What's the psychology of courage? And I was thinking, I couldn't come up with anything. And I said, does that mean I've never once in my life felt courageous? Say, well, it might be. But I was thinking, no, I'm not. I'm no hero, but I'm probably on the lower side of the bell curve, but I ain't at the rock bottom. So I was trying to think, maybe it is that the psychology of courage is very elusive. So I went to the soldiers and went to the philosophers, and the soldiers are struggling with this all the time. And as you would guess, here's what it is. Either they just medal-winning performances, guys who win medals, doubt that they were courageous. They like to hear that they were. Other people told them that they were, and this might assuage some of their internal anxieties. But they look around at the guys who are dead, and they didn't die. They got their medal. They think, I must have held something back. I held something back. These guys didn't hold anything back. Or they have these doubts about, why didn't I die if I were so courageous? And then they also know that the only internal states they can remember are one of great confusion or scared out of their wits. So it's just like in one case, I guess one of the one times in my life somebody thought I did a courageous thing. I was so terrified, I got so confused that instead of running away, I ran this way. Ran for the source of the danger, and then you look like a hero for a second.
Well, it's certainly, you're saying in a number of ways, it's not formulaic. That when you think, people that look like they should be courageous or have acted in the past under certain circumstances, it all comes apart.
It doesn't all come apart, though, because we still predict and we still know that some people, we can predict pretty well who's going to come through in some crunches. We'll do better than average, I think. I think Abner Small was exaggerating a little bit. There's just we know that some people, even among our children, let's say if you look at your own kids, you know that some scare easier than others, some are cooler and stressful situations than others, and you would figure that because of that disposition of theirs, they would be more likely to pull things together under the crunch. Not necessarily guaranteed that they will, but you would guess that they're more likely. But there's also kind of an interesting thing that there are some people who just don't scare easy. I mean, really don't scare at all. That one soldier said about Ulysses S. Grant that Ulysses don't scare worth a damn. And there's some people that we look at and we say, that guy has no fear. If you're a kid growing up playing ball, you know that some people just simply not only didn't fear getting hit, they liked getting hit. And so there are that, and a couple of psychologists did a study, some Brits and some Americans did some studies in World War II about the people who didn't crack. And they found that only 2% under unrelenting battle conditions just seemed to thrive. And they said these are mostly bad apple guys. I mean, these are guys that become middle linebackers, right? The 2% is all they did. And what's kind of interesting is there's the biblical story of Gideon. God assembling the troops, and he says he sends 30,000. There's 30,000 to begin with, and 22,000 go to Mount Gilead in terror. And then of the 8,000 remaining, God says only like send those down to drink, and pick those who lappeth like the water like dogs. And it turns out there's only 300. So 300 out of 30,000 are your berserks, and the ones who just have a disconnect between fear and everything. Aristotle called those people Celts. I mean, he just said the Celtic people are like that. They don't fear anything. So there's no virtue there. They have no fear. He says they're afraid of neither flood nor fire nor flood, or earthquake nor flood. And there's a sense that at least for us to give a virtue, we want to have the sense that people are at least aware of danger and can perceive the anxieties that come with danger. So the totally stupid person who doesn't know that there's any risk, for instance, or doesn't know that he's in a risky situation doesn't get credit for courage. He's just lucky, lucked out, or something like that.
I was kind of like thinking about a tragic hero. I mean, for tragedy to exist rather than pathetic or pathetic.
He's got to have some
He's got
awareness.
to have awareness of what it is and know that it's coming if he does certain actions.
Well, there's Tim O'Brien, who's written some good novels and one wonderful memoir of the Vietnam War called If I Die in a Combat Zone, wanted desperately to come to terms with courage and what its content was. And he describes courage as requiring self-consciousness. It requires that you actually have awareness of the risk and awareness of your own relation to courage itself. And he talks to this guy in his unit, the medic, Doc. They always call Doc. That's the name the medic gets in every unit. And Doc, it turns out, had done something very heroic the day before. He ran out in the midst of total fire, just a big firefight, to rescue or minister to a dying soldier. The soldier was a goner when he got there. He was a goner when he ran out. He knew it. He just wanted to give some comfort to the guy as he's dying. Bullets are flying all around. So O'Brien asks the Doc, he says, so what'd you think? How did you think about your relation to the kind of courage? And he said, I didn't think. Somebody hollers medic, I just run. And O'Brien's kind of disappointed in that. And I think he was unfair to Doc. Doc's being modest, for one thing. He doesn't say, hey, I'm a hero, I wanted to show how courageous I was. He says, I was just doing my duty kind of thing. And he also Doc talked the language of luck. He said, maybe I just wouldn't get hit, that's all. Maybe I wouldn't get hit. And that didn't satisfy O'Brien. He didn't like this. He didn't like this unreflective style, but I think he misread it. If Doc isn't courageous, nobody is. So maybe the difference between a courageous medic and one who's struggling with the virtue is that he did respond like that when somebody hollered medic. That's what a courageous medic does. So it's more complicated. We don't want all that much self-consciousness about it. We don't want, no awareness of the risk. But we also want people to respond quickly in certain settings and not mull and
Takes so long to respond.
Is this the kind of... The philosophers, many of the philosophers will talk about the virtue as being that which... It's a mobilization of what they call practical reason. You have to only employ it for worthy goals. And they say these are kind of judgments that are somewhat hard to calculate. Well, emergencies require courage. You don't have time to say, is this a worthy emergency for me to get involved in? Should I risk my life? What's the likelihood of success? No, the courageous react and the uncourageous mull and say, is this the kind of thing I get involved with or something like this? I think it misrepresents the extent to which there is a certain kind of just likelihood of a positive reaction without all that much thinking that goes on sometimes.
Well, and there's been a number of people who just simply reacted, like you said, and responded to the situation.
Well, now here's an example, falling on the grenade. Now, people are troubled by that, and they don't often call it courage, and probably justly so. The guy reacts, he just sees a grenade, and he falls on it. The way it gets talked about often is in the biblical line, greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for a friend. And they see it as a manifestation of greater love. Something else. It's like courage, of course, comes along for the ride, but it's actually love of their comrades that's getting the reflex reaction. I mean, they react so fast that nobody would be blamed for being a coward for not falling on the grenade. You would never blame somebody who didn't do it. So cowardice is not the issue there. And so they often don't think it's quite courage. It's something even greater. And it's that greater love hath no man. And the soldiers often talk about it in exactly that way.
It's very interesting because that implies there's been some cultivation of thinking about that beforehand, or of developing that and then responding off of it. But it wouldn't happen, I don't think, the spontaneous combustion to go from 0 to 60, and to react. I don't know.
Well, the soldiers think a lot about what it takes to do those kind of things, and they discuss it in these memoirs. And I said earlier, I think I started to say something about this, that it's a real treat to see, to read these things. Here's these guys, they're boys, mostly boys. They go to war, and many of them would never have ever stuck a pen to paper but for having gone to war. I mean, if they wrote a composition in English class in high school, they probably were bored out of their minds. They probably didn't do well at it, or who knows what. something about the connection between their experience in war and their desire to somehow come to terms with their own behavior under this kind of stress leads many of them to not only write, but to write well. And you find that some of them have minor literary talents. I mean, and some of them have major literary talents. And it's just, you just look at these things, some of them are aware that there's a little class issue involved too. So Philip Caputo, who wrote a very powerful memoir of the Vietnam War called A Rumor of War, writes an epilogue to a reissuing of the book a couple of years ago. And he talks about the enormous bibliography, soldier bibliography of the Vietnam War, that it's the one war more soldiers have written about than any other war that Americans have been involved in. And he talks about the bibliography, and he talks about how good a lot of these memoirs and writings are. And he says, and these are from us guys who weren't the smart guys who went to the good colleges, right? This is what, we were the guys who went to the community colleges or couldn't get into college. And he said, not only can we fight better than you guys, we can write better than you guys. It's very,
That's one of the
sticking it to you.
That's one of the things when I, after I finished the book, that I was reflecting on is this country, the United States, has struggled with what was the Vietnam War. How are we going to handle that? What does it mean? You know, what was Vietnam? What was this country? And what was the conflict that was going on? And we were talking before the program about Krista Haas's book about the wall, meaning the Vietnam Memorial. So there's these attempts, and I was thinking this book kind of fits into some of that too, the reflections about how do we bring this all together with the concepts that we have for
When I asked about my own motives in writing this, I became aware, I think just when I was writing the conclusion, that in a sense although there's no autobiographical component in this book at all, it's too serious for that. That it maybe in a vague way is coming to terms with my own not having fought. And there was a war I was eligible to fight in. It was the Vietnam War. And like everybody else in my social class, we in a sense bought substitutes. I mean, you know, you didn't pay out, but there were ways that if you came from a certain social class or went to certain schools, whether you went or not was purely voluntary in effect. And you look back and you realize that you can't do that in a democracy. Everybody's got to share the risk, it seems to me. Now that I'm an old man and never going to have that risk, I can sit back and say, well, maybe I wasn't quite right back then. Maybe I should have shared the risk. But so there might be some motive behind this, is to come to terms with the fact that I never got tested like these guys did. And I always wonder, the great mystery is, I think that little boys always grow up with, is how would I do in battle? Would I turn and run? Would I just lie in a heap cowering and shivering and crying? Or would I, like those poor Union troops who marched up the hill at Mary's Heights and at Fredericksburg, or the poor Southerners who marched up the hill at Gettysburg, wave after wave, or those Brits who went over the top on July 1st, 1916? Would have done it? Or what did it take for those guys to do that, for God's sakes? Not so much the first wave, where you could have some illusion that maybe you'd actually break through and the other side might turn and run, but the second wave, where you saw that first wave all lying dead in front of you. How did they go forward? And they did. And I think there's this sense of where you always wonder just how you would have done.
Well, it was an interesting read, and I think it's also a nice addition to the scholarship, trying to understand this particular quality.
Thanks.
Thanks for being in Rip Rap.
My pleasure.